Last week, we looked at Kant's argument that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility. This week, we'll be looking at two conclusions that Kant immediately draws from this result. The conclusions are that space and time are transcendently ideal, yet empirically real. So first, to understand what these conclusions mean, we have to consider what empirical and transcendental mean in this context. Empirical means having to do with particular mental states, while transcendental means having to do with the general forms of our cognitive faculties. So now Kant has in mind a fourfold distinction between what's empirically ideal and empirically real on the one hand, and between what's transcendently ideal and transcendently real on the other. So something is empirically ideal if it is dependent on a particular mental state, while something is empirically real, by contrast, if it's independent of any particular mental state. So for example, my hallucination of a pink elephant is empirically ideal, since as soon as I stop hallucinating, the elephant goes away. By contrast, something's transcendentally ideal if it depends on the general forms of our cognitive faculties, and something is transcendently real if it's independent of our cognitive faculties altogether. Kant grants that there are transcendently real things in themselves. Kant's claim is that space and time are transcendently ideal and empirically real. So this means that space and time are not things or relations among things that are wholly independent of our cognitive faculties. As Kant writes at A26, B42, space represents no property at all of any things in themselves, nor any relation of them to each other. And at A32, B49, time is not something that would subsist for itself or attach to things as an objective determination, and thus remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of the intuition of them. Instead, space and time are transcendently ideal. As Kant writes at A26, B42, space is nothing other than merely the form of all appearances of outer sense. And at A33, B49, time is nothing other than the form of inner sense. But this does not mean that space and time are empirically ideal. Kant explicitly rejects this at B69. Kant explains that while illusions depend on particular mental states, space and time are independent of any particular mental states and depend only on the forms of our cognitive faculties in general. Moreover, for space and time to be empirically real means that all the objects of our public and objective experience are in space and time. So now the question is, how do these conclusions follow from Kant's previous result that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility? It's relatively easy to see how the empirical reality of space and time follows from space and time being the forms of our faculty of sensibility. The argument is that the only way objects can appear to us is by affecting our faculty of sensibility. So since the forms of our faculty of sensibility are space and time, the only way that objects can appear to us is by being in space and time. But it's not so easy to see how Kant's conclusion follows that space and time are transcendently ideal and not transcendently real. The result from last week is that space and time are the forms of our faculty of sensibility. But what gives Kant the right to claim that space and time are merely the forms of our faculty of sensibility and not also properties or relations among things in themselves? Why couldn't it be both? Why couldn't space and time be forms of our faculty of sensibility and also transcendently real things in themselves, or transcendently real properties or relations among things in themselves? This is called the problem of the neglected alternative. Kant seeks to disprove the Newtonian thesis that space and time are transcendently real things in themselves, as well as the Leibnizian thesis that space and time are a system of relations among transcendently real things in themselves. But Kant seems to have neglected to consider the alternative, that space and time are both forms of our faculty of sensibility and also Newtonian transcendently real things in themselves, or alternatively, Leibnizian systems of relations among transcendently real things in themselves. This is one of the most long-standing and intractable problems of Kant scholarship. One interpretive approach is to say that while Kant wrote space and time are not transcendently real, he didn't really mean it. Or at least, he didn't mean this strong claim, but some weaker claim. As we can call this sort of interpretive approach a deflationary reading. The weakest version of a deflationary reading is agnosticism. According to agnosticism, all Kant meant to conclude was that, for all we can know, space and time are not transcendently real. The problem for agnosticism is that Kant was certainly capable of writing, for all we can know, space and time are not transcendently real. And instead, Kant asserted the stronger claim that space and time are not properties of things in themselves. So agnosticism has no basis whatsoever in the text. Karl Amerik's, in one of the readings for today, offers a more sophisticated deflationary reading that has more of a basis in the text. Amerix points out that just before drawing the conclusions that space and time are not transcendently real, Kant explains how space and time being forms of our faculty of sensibility provides insight into the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge. At B40 and 41, Kant explains that geometry is possible as a synthetic a priori science of space only because we have an a priori intuition of space, which is possible only because space is the a priori form of our faculty of sensibility, and at B49 that the general theory of motion is possible only because time is an a priori intuition, which again is possible only because time is an a priori form of our faculty of sensibility. Now, Amarex's claim is that while space and time being the transcendently ideal forms of our faculty of sensibility makes it intelligible how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible, even if space and time were transcendently real, this would not make it intelligible how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Amarex thinks that while this doesn't exclude the possibility that space and time are transcendently real, it gives Kant the right to neglect this possibility. For after all, the transcendental reality of space and time would be irrelevant to the question of how our synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. On Amarex's interpretation, Kant finally excludes the mere possibility that space and time are transcendently real in its antinomies. In the antinomies, Kant distinguishes direct and indirect proofs of transcendental idealism. The thought is that a direct proof of transcendental idealism gives us insight into the grounds of transcendental idealism, or it teaches us what makes transcendental idealism true. An indirect proof, by contrast, will show us that transcendental idealism must be true without teaching us why. And the antinomies provide indirect proofs by showing us that the transcendental reality of space and time would allow us to derive contradictions. Lucy Allais, in the essay written by her for today's class, offers a deflationary reading that has an even better basis in the text. Allais asks us to look at the passage in which Kant asserts that space and time are not transcendently real. At A26b42, what Kant writes is that space represents no property at all of any things in themselves, nor any relation of them to each other. And what Allais draws our attention to in this passage is the word represents. Allais points out that Kant does not say here that space is no property at all of things in themselves. Instead, what Kant writes is that space represents no property at all of things in themselves. So Allais' idea is that what Kant is trying to make a claim about is not space itself, but rather our representation of space. According to Allais, Kant's claim is that our representation of space is not a representation of anything in itself, or any relation among things in themselves. Kant's argument for this claim, according to Allais, is that our representations of space and time are a priori intuitions, which they can be only because space and time are a priori forms of our faculty of sensibility, and that a priori intuitions can never be representations of things in themselves, since intuitions are defined as immediately presenting their objects to us, and things in themselves, which are wholly independent of our minds, cannot be immediately present to us a priori, but only by affecting the mind in some way. Now, like Amarex, Allais grants that Kant does in fact deny that space and time themselves are things in themselves. According to Allais, Kant's aesthetic doesn't argue for this strong conclusion, but the Kant does provide indirect proofs of this strong conclusion in his antinomies. Again, where he shows that the transcendental reality of space and time allows us to derive contradictions. Now, one problem for Allais' interpretation is that while it does find support in the text of Kant's treatment of space in the Aesthetic, where Kant writes that space represents no property at all of any things in themselves, Allais' interpretation does not find support in the text of Kant's Aesthetic regarding time. There, Kant doesn't say that time represents no thing in itself. Instead, Kant writes, time is not something that would subsist for itself or attach to things as an objective determination, and thus remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of the intuition of them. He writes, time is nothing other than the subjective condition under which all intuitions can take place in us. So there's no clear textual evidence that Kant's intended conclusion in the Aesthetic regards our representations of space and time rather than space and time themselves. A second problem with Allais' interpretation that goes for Amarex's interpretation as well is that Kant clearly does deny that space and time are transcendently real. Amarex and Allais recognize this point, and they think that Kant excludes the transcendental reality of space and time in his antinomies, where he provides indirect proofs. But the problem is that these indirect proofs are meant to show us that space and time are transcendently ideal, but they are not meant to give us any insight into what makes space and time transcendently ideal. Kant is meant to provide a direct proof of the transcendental ideality of space and time that shows us why it is that space and time don't apply to any things in themselves. On Amarix's and Alaiz's interpretation, there simply is no direct proof of this strong conclusion. Kant holds that space and time cannot be transcendently real, and he gives us no direct proof teaching us why. A more satisfying interpretation would reconstruct a direct proof for the strong conclusion that space and time cannot be properties or relations of things in themselves. Now, the other two readings for today attempt to provide solutions to the problem of Kant's neglected alternative by reconstructing an argument for this strong conclusion. The argument Allison constructs aims to show that given that space and time are forms of sensibility, it would be logically impossible for space and time to be transcendentally real. And the argument Hogan constructs aims to show that given that space and time are forms of sensibility, it would be metaphysically impossible for space and time to be transcendentally real. Allison presents his interpretation by distinguishing what he calls presentational and comparative orders. The idea here is that a presentational order is an order that pertains to things in virtue of our experience of them. So for example, the order of countries I've visited in Europe. Suppose first I visited England, and then I visited France, and then I visited Norway. This ordering, England, France, Norway, pertains to these countries, not in themselves, but in virtue of my experience of them, my visiting them in that order. In contrast to a presentational order is a comparative order. Comparative order, Allison explains, is an ordering of things that pertains to them in virtue of some intrinsic property of the things, which is independent of our experience of them. So for example, if you think intelligence is an intrinsic property of people, then a ranking of the students in this class from most intelligent to least intelligent would be a comparative order. Now, Allison's reconstruction of Kant's argument that space and time cannot be transcendentally real is that as forms of sensibility, space and time are presentational orders. That is, relations among things that pertain to the things in virtue of our possible experience. But Allison maintains that it would be nonsensical for things in themselves to stand in any presentational order, since things in themselves are defined as being independent of our possible experience. It follows that space and time cannot be relations among things in themselves. In a different essay, Allison likens the idea of spatiotemporal things in themselves to the idea of a square circle. For Allison, it is logically impossible or nonsensical for space and time to be properties or relations of things in themselves. Des Hogan offers an alternative to Allison, on which it's not logically impossible, but instead metaphysically impossible for space and time to be properties or relations of things in themselves. Hogan introduces his solution by distinguishing two interpretations of Kant's claim that things in themselves are unknowable. On an epistemic interpretation of unknowable, things in themselves are unknowable in the sense that they exceed our cognitive powers. Hogan thinks that this is the common interpretation, but Hogan offers us a different metaphysical interpretation. On Hogan's metaphysical interpretation, things in themselves are unknowable in the sense that they lack a determining ground through which they could be known a priori, even in principle. To see what Hogan means by a determining ground here, think about the fog. One way that we can know it's foggy is by looking outside and seeing the fog. This would be a way of knowing that it's foggy by the effects of the fog, namely the visual appearance to our perception. Another way of knowing that it's foggy would be by knowing that the conditions that cause the fog obtain. If I know that when the temperature reaches the dew point, fog occurs, and I know that the temperature has currently reached the dew point, then I can know, independent of observation, that it's foggy. Now Hogan points out that there was a tradition of rationalist philosophers before Kant, going back to Leibniz, according to which every feature of reality has a determining ground. According to this tradition, every feature of reality can be known non-empirically. Hogan points out that another of Kant's predecessors, Christian Crusius, denied that every feature of reality has a determining ground, since Crusius held a commitment to our freedom. And according to Hogan, Kant follows Crusius in affirming that our free actions lack determining grounds. So in Hogan's interpretation, this is the first premise in Kant's argument that space and time are not transcendently real. The premise is that certain things in themselves, namely our free actions, are indeterministic in the sense that they lack determining grounds through which they could be known a priori. The second premise is that space and time underwrite a priori knowledge of nature as a deterministic order, such that if space and time were properties or relations of things in themselves, then things in themselves would be wholly deterministic. It follows from this that space and time cannot be properties or relations of things in themselves. What I want you to do in writing your essays for this week is to consider what you think the most compelling strategy is for responding to the problem of the neglected alternative. If you can come up with your own solution to the problem of the neglected alternative, think about how it fits with respect to the deflationary, logical impossibility, and metaphysical impossibility readings, and what recommends your alternative over these.